But we don't agree that there are going to be policies of a U.S. president that are going to affect the number of sunny or rainy days, right?
That's not true. There could be.
Like what, man?
Cloud seeding.
Okay. So
for me, the central issue in our government today is that whether you're on the right, on the left, you're a Bernie supporter, you're a Trump supporter, you're a Jeb Bush supporter, whatever you may be, Jill Stein, anything in between, our government does not care about the interest of the American people, whether it be through incompetence, through the fact that it's just become this unmanageable, huge bureaucracy, or it's through corruption or incompetence. I forget which one I said already. The average will of the voter is not something that's entertained by the people that really run our government. The people that really run things aren't necessarily the elected officials. They will come and go. But it's more the bureaucrats behind the scenes that are unelected, in tandem with a bunch of people with cultural power, like people that are billionaires, people that are in charge of aspects like social media, corporate America, academia, the entertainment industry, etc. These institutions really run our country, and they're not really concerned about you, the average person, whether you be on the right, left, atheist, Christian, whatever, black, white, doesn't matter to them. They're interested in entrenching their own power. And this means that they will be corrupt if it means to stopping someone that they think is outside of that control of their power. Donald Trump got elected, and I supported him in 2016, in this promise of draining the swamp. And I voted for him for two reasons. One was so that the average person could see that this swamp exists and how dangerous it is. And that certainly has been proven because of the hubris of the people in these institutions like the FBI that couldn't help themselves. They outed their corruption, that they were in tandem with the mainstream media, academia, and all these other places. And then secondly, which Trump did not do a good job of, is now that we know this and the average person sees it, do something about it. I think Trump is better positioned this time, and a lot of the appointments that he's been making and things that he's been talking about is designed to actually do something about that corruption. And the goal is that this would actually be a saving grace for this country and the world, because we could get back to governance by people that actually cared about their constituents rather than entrenching their own power. We could get back to a government where our elected leaders were the ones that had power and therefore accountability, as opposed to unelected bureaucrats that we have no power over. So that's ultimately why I support Donald Trump. For all the issues you talked about, I think that I will be able to clearly articulate why I think Trump would be better for things like personal freedoms, for the environment, and all of those issues, because a precursor to having a discussion, for example, let's say me and you have a lengthy disagreement about what our regulation should be on water purity when it comes to a specific, watershed in my state's Pennsylvania, right? We might have a vehement disagreement, but the truth is it doesn't matter what me and you think. No one gives a shit. You better hope that the people at the CIA agree with you. You better hope that the people in corporate America agree with you that are actually controlling the levers of power. Because whatever our disagreement is and who's right and who's wrong becomes irrelevant if we don't have a voice. And I don't think there's been an election that illustrates that more than the Democratic Party literally lying to people for years about Joe Biden's cognitive health, then waiting till he was the de facto winner of the primary, then forcing Joe Biden out so that they could...
Getting off the topic.
Well, just real quick, let me finish. To install someone in Kamala Harris that no Democratic voter voted for. So it is a clear illustration that they represent not the will of the people. They actually represent institutional power. And I think Trump, with a coalition of RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, and a bunch of people like that, illustrate the exact opposite.
All right. I think that you made your point in the first half and then kind of started to talk about Biden and Kamala when, our debate is about Trump and whether he's going to be good or bad. But okay,
But just real quick, if my position is that there is this institutional control, right, and that Trump represents a break from that, then I think it's completely reasonable to talk about the people involved in that institutional control.
Okay, yeah, but again, I don't want to debate Kamala and Biden. I think that we're past that, but I mean, I can't.
I'm talking about the DNC.
I think that we could debate on those points. I just don't want to get bogged down on those points.
That's fine, but let me be clear. I'm not talking about Biden or Kamala. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the people that control them. Lied.
That's fine. That's
right.
Fine.
Do you understand the difference?
Let's focus on the future here about the impacts that are going to come, right? Because there's so much to talk to. Because I think that we do agree on the problems and we disagree on the solutions. Like the problems that you articulated here about billionaire elite influence in our politics, the corruption, which I would attribute to lobbying. And I don't think Trump's going to do any rules to change the nature of lobbying. So I don't think that addresses the actual fundamental issue. The unelected bureaucrats thing, I hear you. And I would like to get your take on just the concept of expertise in general, right? Because generally, you'd think that you would want relevant experts in positions where they can use their expertise to make decisions that are informed. And I don't know how, like, if you want to open up every single like decision making position in the executive branch of government up for a vote, like how is the average person supposed to vote for who's going to make the better decisions at the NIH? Like they're not informed for those kinds of picks. Like at what point do you have the experts in a field making the decisions, and at what point do you say, well, I don't trust the experts to make an informed decision. I want the democratic people to make those decisions or to appoint those experts. Like, do you know what I'm trying to get at here?
Well, let me see if I can re-articulate your position, Steelman, your position. You tell me if you think this is accurate. Not every position in a bureaucracy should be elected through purely democratic means. For example, if we said who would be the best undersecretary at the Department of Health, the average person would have no clue. So if you just put that up for a vote, it would be difficult for them to say, oh, I think Barry Smith would be better than Lisa Grunwald because, what I'm really looking for an undersecretary, right? They wouldn't have a clue. So you're saying at some point you appoint people that you then trust in these specific agencies to appoint experts that maybe me and you and the average person doesn't have a voice on, but at some point we can't have pure democracy on every issue. Is that?
Yeah. And that was actually a very articulate way of, I think that you expressed that better than I did. And I just want to make one point is that is one reason I don't like Donald Trump's picks, is that I feel like he's appointing people for ideological reasons rather than appointing people who are experts in those areas, like the EPA, right? He just appointed Lee Zeldin, who's never taken a course in environmental science or anything. I mean, he's not a relevant expert for the EPA at all. He's like a big oil guy. Like he's a congressman that's very cozy up to big oil interests. So like these are the things that I think are bad, to be appointing people that do not have the relevant expertise to be heads of departments where that expertise is important for day-to-day decisions.
Okay, so there's several things to say about this. I guess maybe the easiest way to go about it would be to remind you what I think my worldview is, which is that these bureaucracies have become so entrenched that they actually wield the power and they're not responsive to the American people at all. They sort of exist outside the scope of our democracy, of our republic. And so it's not a matter of giving me an up-down vote for all of us on an undersecretary of health. It's a matter of they should at least hear the will of the people and try to exist and try to govern to the benefit of the will of the people. Not, oh, what we really mean by democracy, and this is what these institutions mean, is what we collectively as institutions agree with. And if the people disagree with us, then they're a threat to democracy. And we could get into the specifics of this, where you see with a lot of the calls to censor disinformation online, they say it's because it's a threat to democracy. They don't mean a threat to the will of the people. They mean a threat to their bureaucracies. That's what matters. What matters when they call democracy, what they mean is what the FBI thinks, what the Department of Health thinks, what people at Facebook think, what academia thinks. They don't mean what each person means, what the collective will of the people is. And so if we start with that assumption and that there's either corruption or entrenched bureaucracy, that means that the average person not only no longer has a say, but they're completely irrelevant to this discussion, then when you say expert, what you're really saying is people that exist within that entrenched bureaucracy that don't care about the will of the people. Because who would be an expert but for the people that are already in that bureaucracy? So I would liken it to this. You can imagine a hierarchy or a system of governance that's corrupt, correct? That's something that you could imagine. Let's say, hypothetically, can I ask you this real quick? I don't mean to presume anything. Would you identify as more left-leaning, like with your politics?
Yeah,
okay.
Generally.
I don't want to make presumptions, so you tell me if I say something that doesn't accurately represent you. But would you be someone that believed that in the United States in the past, particularly maybe in the Jim Crow South, that we had police departments that were racist and corrupt?
Yeah.
Okay, so imagine then if I said, well, I'm not besmirching the people of this town, but let's say I say Athens, Georgia, right? And hypothetically, it was terribly racist in 1930. I don't know that, but let's say that's true. And the police department was corrupt, and they're framing black men, and they're planting drugs on them, and they're just framing them. And I say, look, when a new sheriff comes into town and he starts appointing deputies, he has to appoint someone who's an expert on law enforcement in Athens, Georgia. And you would say, but Rob, that's a problem because everyone that's been involved in law enforcement in Athens, Georgia has done so in a corrupt regime. We need someone from outside of that. That's the exact argument I would make when it comes to sort of these agencies that you're talking about. If you're going to drain the swamp, the problem is that Trump found out in 2016 that all of the people to work on his campaign and then the tens of thousands of people that you have to have appointed once you become president, who is qualified for that? Well, it's going to be people that have perpetually existed within that bureaucracy. So if you appoint someone that's outside the scope of it, the criticism will always be, but they're not an expert. And one little thing I'll say in addition to this is I'll bet you didn't criticize when we saw people like Pete Buttigieg being appointed to Department of Transportation. So this happens quite frequently where people are put. It's the only expertise that Pete Buttigieg had was being part of this bureaucracy. That's it.
Okay, wait.
He's not like an engineer.
Sure. I am not a fan of Pete Buttigieg, and I really was not a fan of his appointment. I will make that clear. But I want to explain why I think that what you just laid out is not analogous to what we're talking about. I understand when you're saying, like, you know, who is qualified to be put in charge of the CIA or the FBI? Well, the only people that are qualified are the people that were brought up in those institutions, and those people are going to be corrupt, blah, blah. I understand the nature of your argument for certain departments, but in other departments where the expertise, like to be appointed the head of the EPA, you don't need to have been brought up in the EPA swamp or whatever you want to call it. You could appoint somebody that just has a degree in environmental science they could be totally unrelated, just a relevant expert in the science.
I disagree. What do you think the average political leanings of someone with a degree in environmental science is?
Very left. I mean,
right.
That's correct. Same can be said for somebody with a degree in theoretical physics.
The point is, then what you're suggesting is there is an agency that exists, the Environmental Protection Agency. People that believe in small government thinks that it's overly burdensome, that it is corrupt, that it specifically targets specifics and individual. In fact, it's ironic. You criticize lobbying. Well, the best way to take away the effect of lobbying is to stop giving the government so many powers with regulations. Because the way it works is this. Some company that wants to pollute, what they do is they pay off and grease the correct wheels in government. Then regulations are implanted that they have loopholes that they could get out of, and those regulations actually affect the people that are more small businesses, people that are more likely. So the point, I'll put a bow on it just real quick. So I think that the point you're making is you're suggesting that experts be appointed from a pool of people that will already be theoretically in this swamp. Because remember, the swamp that I'm talking about, I already included much of academia, which is why it's a very good thing what Trump's suggesting about the Department of Education and taking away credentials from universities that are actually more interested in teaching things like DEI than actual hard sciences.
Okay, let's definitely talk about that next then. Sure. Because first of all, very curious about how you consider the swamp to include academia. First of all, I just want to say, like, when you're saying that these, climate scientists or environmental scientists, or like I said, theoretical physicists tend to be towards the left compared to the average, that's just a statistic. You can find right-leaning, relevant scientific experts.
Name me one.
The pool is smaller, but those are available.
Name me one. Who should Trump have put?
Go and just appoint some coal lobbyists like Trump did in his first
term.
Me
one.
Name me one.
Right. Name me one right-leaning environmental scientist that graduated from one of these universities that you would think would qualify as an expert.
Your position, right, is that because, and I will just clarify that it's not my field. I can't even name you one environmental scientist generally of any political leaning, but regardless of whether or not I can name them, are you trying to spread doubt that there even exists a right-leaning environmental scientist?
No, I'm assuming that there could be a handful of them, but I'm betting if they were appointed, even if not used specifically, what would happen would be people would say, but they're not well thought of in the field, right? And these people exist. For example, if he appointed someone that graduated from some degree from a university that you find credentialed that says, actually, I think climate change is massively overblown. Here's my research into it. I think that the people that say that climate change is such a threat, many of them are doing it for personal reasons because they exist to get government grants. If he appointed someone like that and they had a degree in environmental science, I bet you would say, this is a pseudoscientist. This is someone that we don't agree with. In effect, what you're doing is this. If you start from the position that a agency like the EPA is overly burdensome and that they're actually part of the problem because it encourages lobbying, and so you appoint someone that is from the side of it that's like an industry that has used the EPA to lobby, right? And you say, well, that person's not an expert. It would be the same as a president that wanted to criticize law enforcement. Let's say the agency of the FBI, and they specifically pick like a bail activist, or they pick a defense attorney that argues vehemently for the defense of the accused. You would say, oh, but why would you appoint someone like that? Clearly you want to appoint someone from law enforcement, not from someone on the opposite side of it. But clearly you see the problem with that. How could you have significant reform if you only appoint people within that stand to come from an industry or come from a background that would suggest the self-importance of that agency and the need to promulgate it?
So your entire argument there seemed to start with a presupposition about, if we assume that the EPA is just overburdensome, blah, 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 why would I start with that presupposition?
So what do they do that's good? Go ahead.
Protect the environment.
In what way? Give me an example.
Okay, they regulate businesses to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Have they been doing a good job?
They've been doing a better job than their absence, but overall, mixed.
Compared to their absence, like when?
Yeah. Like, if we look at other countries that don't have an equivalent, or we look at before the history of the EPA.
Well, the other country is going to be clearly a false equivalency. Right? What are you comparing it to China?
What point are you trying to make right now, Rob? Are you saying that the EPA doesn't do anything to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions?
No, what I'm saying is you are starting under the assumption the EPA is doing what kind of job? And you're like, well, they're doing okay. It would be worse without them. My articulation is I don't think so. I don't think that there's any proof that the EPA that without the EPA would be in a situation that was massively worse. In fact, to the contrary, do you think Let's see if we can compare more apples to apples comparison. Were you okay with the EPA under Trump's first administration?
No.
Okay, and do you think they did a poor job?
Yes.
In what way? They didn't lower greenhouse gas emissions?
Not only did they not lower it, but they actually increased greenhouse gas emissions by like 200 million metric tons of CO2. They increased methane emissions, which are 20 times more potent than greenhouse gas emissions. They rolled back regulations on the proper disposal for coal plants that made the water quality worse off, I think, in your own state of Pennsylvania. So, they're increasing health risks, like negative health externalities for American people, and they're overall contributing to the increased rate of climate change, which is super bad for the human species.
Before we go on, I don't know. Perhaps you're absolutely right about this. I assume you feel you're well informed on this. It seems how you debate science. So you're absolutely certain that when Trump came into office in 2017 and when he left in 2020, greenhouse gas emissions were going up every year?
This is greenhouse gases due to the regulation rollbacks over the next decade. The 200 number that I just quoted from you is from an analysis up through 2025 based on without the regulations in place over the next decade from when he rolled them back, how many excess greenhouse gas emissions will there be?
So just to be clear, my specific question was, did greenhouse gas emissions go up or down during Trump? You said went up. Now, you know that that's not the truth. You know they went down, correct? Just a yes or no will suffice.
Okay. I think we're talking about two different things.
No.
I know you really want me to say yes or no. Let me just clarify what we're talking about right here. What I'm comparing, right, is a comparison of the United States trajectory with Trump versus without Trump. What you're comparing is just the overall total greenhouse gas emissions per year, which is going to be multivariate because there's a lot more influencing that number than just Trump's policies.
Did the greenhouse gas emissions go up or down when Trump was in office?
They went up, but the rate of increase was basically plateauing.
Okay, so am I going to have to look up these numbers and see if the rate of the... So what you're saying is...
You can if you want to, but I don't think it's pertinent.
I do think it's pertinent, and here's why. Because what you're going to default to is, okay, even if we were putting out X number of greenhouse gases a year, when you say they went up totally, this is interesting as well. Because yes, you're right. For example, whatever metric you want to use. So what on average in the Obama years would be the amount of greenhouse gases? Give me a typical year under Obama of greenhouse gases What would the
I
measurement
don't
be?
know. You can just make up a number for sake of
But
discussion.
but I don't even know how we measure that. That's the question. Like, what's the unit?
At million metric tons of
Okay,
CO2.
so can I just say this? It goes up before Trump, it went up 10 million metric tons. I'm pulling that number completely out of my ass, but just giving an idea of a number, right?
Okay.
So we have 100 million metric tons in the sky, and then 8 years of Obama, every year it's putting 10 million in. So the number's going up. We're putting more. Now there's 110 million. Then there's 120. Then there's 130. But the level of which it's going up is plateaued. If at Trump's time, tenure, and this is what you say, the total amount went up. So if in Trump's time that immediately drops his first year to 5 million metric tons, you would say, well, the total number went up because we added 5 million. But what I'm talking about is year to year, is that number going down? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and you tell me if you think I'm wrong, what I'm referencing specifically isn't the total amount, because even 1/1000th of a metric ton being put in the air, which would be a remarkable success, you would admit, if that's what the U.S. put, that would still increase the total number. So what I'm asking you specifically is, did the number per year, the average per year, go down under the Trump administration?
No, it went up.
Can you show me the data?
Yes, I will. I'll share it on screen. One of my moderators commented here, if you would like to look up their source here. Published May 2019 from Rhodium Group. CO2 emissions rose by 2.7% in 2018, which was the second largest annual increase since the year 2000.
So you stop at 2018. Why is that?
Because we are having this discussion on the fly. I didn't prepare these numbers in advance. This is just what a moderator in my chat
so for
shared.
example, I'm looking at, let me see where this comes from World Bank.
I just want to know what point you're trying to make. Like, if this data showed exactly what you hope it does, what is the point you're trying to make from this?
What I'm saying is the argument, we have to start under the supposition. You said, well, we have to discuss whether the EPA is achieving successes or not. So the first thing we need to do is look at a time period of the EPA and say whether or not they did good or bad. So you think they did well or not. So we take the Trump years, the first Trump administration, which seems to be something beneficial, right? If we're talking about how we suspect Trump will be in this term, we should look back to the previous term he has. That might give us some idea. You agree with that?
I don't know how much you can read to the second term based on the first term. I don't know how much that translates.
Okay, well, I think that's as good of a comparison as we'll be able to make. And so in our attempt to do that, when you say, well, I think he did poorly.
I think we can make a much better comparison. And this comparison was made in a published study that I cited for you. I can share it on screen if you want.
That's fine. It just seems odd that it stops halfway through Trump's term.
No, that's not. It's a different one. This is the initial one. So this is what I initially quoted from you, that 200 million number. So this is the source for it. I know it's academia, so that you might already say that it's not true. But if we just scroll down to their first figure, this is their source for their data. This is, again, data from the EPA. Maybe you say, oh, it can't be trusted. But this is a comparison based on these 2025 estimates, like I told you. This is comparing what the U.S. without these regulations that Trump took away versus if those regulations were still in place.
That's a different question. You once more have changed the question. So now we're dealing with academics that are saying, here is our estimates for what we think these policies will do. This is no different in economics when we had people like Paul Krugman say in 2016, here is our estimates with the things Trump has suggested, how it will crash the stock market and the economy will significantly decline if we elect Trump as president. Those estimates ended up being incorrect. And we oftentimes see that models and estimates from academics end up being incorrect. So what I'm talking about isn't some academic's estimate of what they think will happen. And we can see this all through every government agency and academia all the time. Constantly we see estimates of how much a specific plan will cost. And then it ends up costing way more or way less. And so I'm not interested in the estimate at this point. I'm interested in the actual tangible data that we can see. And I think you know that unless I'm wrong, and I'm willing to admit I'm wrong, that's why I'm asking for the specific data that shows greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, etc. Those types of emissions. We had 4 years of Trump. We've been 4 years removed from that. So now we can see the trends in that data. Did those trends go down over those 4 years of Trump, or did they go up? I'm not interested in what people think the policies that he implemented will do 10 years from now.
I'll show you the numbers. They did go up.
Okay, let's see them.
Make you happy. Here you go. So here's 2016, here's 2017 they went up, here's 2018, and then here's the pandemic, and then here's the Biden years. This goes up to 2022.
Okay, so real quick, can you go, I'm sorry, can you go to 2018?
This is not CO2, this is methane, which is 20 times more potent.
Okay, so we're just looking at methane specifically.
And this can be attributed directly to Trump's policies because he specifically rolled back the regulations responsible for methane emissions for the oil and gas.
So just to be clear, this is just methane. It's not completely greenhouse. Secondly, it looks to me, I can't see, I don't have the greatest eyesight, but it looks to me that those numbers significantly went down in 2019. Correct?
Yeah, in 2019, they go back up to higher than the 2016 numbers.
Okay, so overall, the numbers...
Say, look, it increases. It's the only year, except for, I guess, around here, where you see a significant increase is during Trump's first term. And then they cratered during Biden's term in office and during the pandemic when nobody is emitting.
So I just want to be clear. The numbers were already going down in 2019, correct? Without the pandemic, correct?
Sure.
Okay. Great.
I mean, this is really just what you're trying to hang your hat on right now, Rob?
What I'm trying to hang my hat on is the people that say that Trump's going to be a disaster for the environment. When we say, well, how bad were things under the first term? And they say they were real bad. They were real. Let me finish. You say they were real bad. They were real bad. And then we look at the data. That doesn't look real bad. That looks pretty much in line, and we're continuing to see a downward trend.
It doesn't look real bad to you, Rob, because you have no education in climate science. I mean, come on. Like, why would
your appeal to authority means nothing to me.
Why would you expect to be able to read this chart and just know instantly if it's good or bad? I mean, what would qualify you to have such like an ability to read a chart like this? I don't think that you do. But here, the thing is that if you want to focus specifically on the year between 2018 and 2019, but you want to try to get on me because earlier we were looking at 2017 to 2018, you're doing the same thing. If we compare Trump's entire term, right, it's a net increase, dude. That's exactly what you said was not the case.
That's not true.
Numbers showing it's a net increase.
That's not true, right? First off, if you look at Trump's term versus Obama's term, it's clearly a net decrease. Yes or no?
2016 to 2019,
right?
Net increase. That's just a fact.
When he leaves in 2020, is it higher or lower than when he came in 2016?
Lower because of the pandemic.
Okay, so then when you say it's a fact, when you just said it's a fact that it was a net increase, that's not true.
Okay,
At the
so
end
wait,
of this term, it was down,
you
correct?
Want to include 2020 data in the metrics of Trump's first performance because unemployment numbers, GDP, all those numbers are going to look pretty different for your boy Trump if we include the 2020 year in that data. Do you want to really do that?
Well, I think that that's why he lost the election, correctly. And so I'm certain that you and most Democrats included that data when it came to the decision who to vote for in the 2020 election, correct? So when it was convenient, that's not true at all. Of course they did.
You asked me what data I included in my decision. Well, that was not what I was including in my decision. But if you want to talk generally, sure, maybe that's
right. So generally, that was the Democratic position. And look, we could probably say largely the reason Trump lost in 2020 was because of the economic numbers during the pandemic, correct?
It was a referendum on his handling of the pandemic, yeah.
Okay, in addition to that, I'm not quite sure how much those emissions, particularly these emissions of methane, would have went down because of that. I'm not specifically sure what that would be. We could see that they were already trending in that direction, and it's not like they cratered so much that it would be like, clearly this was an anomaly. It was continuing to trend in the direction that it was going. Thirdly, this is just specifically looking at methane.
It was not.
That's not true. Show it. Bring up the chart. Bring up the chart again.
Okay, I will. It was not continuing the same trend. This is Trump's term. It is bucking the trend. Here's the trend line. Trump's term goes the opposite of the trend line.
It does not. It goes up for two. It goes up for 2 years, just like we can see there were 2 year periods prior that it went up. But again, let's look. When I say it was continuing the trend that we saw from the year previous, from the year of 2018 to 2019, was that drop more significant than from the year 2019 to the year 2020?
I don't know, Rob.
Why? You can see the data right there.
Because I wasn't okay. Go through what you're saying.
Put your mouse on it.
I don't think this is important, but
put your mouse on it.
Yeah, okay. I'll put a mouse on it. I don't know why you're getting bogged down in this detail, but let's go. Which years?
2018.
Okay, 2018.
827. Go to 2019.
Uh-huh.
So that's a 20-point drop. Now go to 2020.
2020. Okay.
Correct. And that's 795. What point drop is that?
It's a little bit over, 12 points or so.
Right. So the drop was more significant from 2018 to 2019 than 2019 to 20. Now, the point I'm trying to make is this. If you give me a moment, I'll articulate this. You're pointing to this saying, this was a disaster. Look at how bad this is. I think that anyone looking at this could see, actually, the trend seems to be a downward trajectory with spikes that go up through a lot of terms. Right? And it doesn't look like that number was uniquely bad to the point that you're like, oh my God, it's so much worse than we've seen in decades prior. In fact, what we see is the 2018 number looks remarkably similar to the 2015 number. So it doesn't seem like it was that much of an anomaly. And thirdly, to say that we can't look at that trend because 2020 was such an outlier because of COVID. But what I'm telling you is it wasn't such an outlier that it made the discrepancy between 2019 and 20 more larger than the difference between 2018 and 2019. All of this paints a picture that isn't, oh my God, Trump was so uniquely bad for the environment. And I remind you, this is just looking at methane. I think that what we were discussing first was greenhouse gas emissions in totality, and I believe that's more of a direct downward trend line, though I could be wrong about that. Nonetheless, the data... Okay, bring up the data. How do you not know this, by the way? If this is something you focus on so heavily, and you have such strong, heartfelt beliefs that Trump was such a disaster when it came to these emissions, how don't you have a clue what the data says?
Because it's pretty obvious from the things that Trump says and the positions and policy positions that he has staked out that he has said on the record, climate change is a hoax. He doesn't even believe in anthropogenic climate change in the first place. That is a pseudoscientific position. And that can be demonstrated empirically with science that is a pseudoscience position.
It depends on what he means by that statement.
What his policies are. He appoints people like Wheeler, who he appointed to the EPA head in his first term, was a literal lobbyist for the coal industry.
Okay.
As the head of the EPA.
And emissions went down.
Does that not just automatically strike you as the exact kind of corruption that you were so against?
No, in fact, that seems like a very anti-scientific approach for you to take. So what you're suggesting now is ignore what the data was, and instead we just say, well, based on what Trump said, and based on the career of the person he appointed at the EPA, then it must be bad, despite the fact what the data shows. The data shows that this wasn't an anomaly so bad that it would be an outlier that you would say, oh my God, that's terrible. Bro. We just saw the data on methane. It doesn't show that. We saw one chart of methane emissions that now you're trying to say was all of the supporting evidence that the EPA was performing poorly under Trump, which was never my argument. Again, you're the one who's wanting me to show you all the data in real time while we're having a discussion. We didn't prepare any of these talking points beforehand, right? I just think it's a little bit disingenuous for, that if the EPA cuts regulations that are designed to limit greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions are going to go up. I don't think, it's crazy to me that you're even arguing otherwise. Okay, so let's remind everyone how we got to this point. You're talking about what a good job the EPA does or why they're so necessary and what a disaster it would be if we have someone appointed there that rolls back some of the regulations that the EPA's had. That's your position, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, then we ask specifically why. The first thing you give is the reason why is you're like, because the environment, particularly emissions. And you said greenhouse gas emissions and methane emissions specifically. That's what you said, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so now you're saying that you think it's unfair for me to ask for the data of how those emissions looked under the first 4 years of Trump, which you're admitting much similarly to now. You're saying just like in this term, in his previous term, he picked someone that you thought was a career sort of fossil fuel guy who would be the exact type of person you wouldn't want leading this, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so then when I ask you, okay, then if you're saying it was a disaster in the first 4 years, can we look at the data of the two areas that you specifically already brought up? Methane and greenhouse gas.
And so I showed you that data.
You did.
You rejected it.
So let me finish. I didn't reject the data. I looked at the data and said, that doesn't look like it was outrageously bad. In fact, he leaves office and it's lower than when he entered office. And you said, yeah, but COVID. And I said, yeah, but that doesn't seem to really explain anything. Everything. We could see that it was already on a downward trend. And the downward trend between 2018 and 2019, well before COVID, seemed to be greater than the downward trend between 2019 and 2020. let me finish my point, please. So what this seems to show is it wasn't the disaster that you suggested. For example, if we would see a similar trend line in this 4 years of Trump when it came to methane emissions specifically, we would see a marginal increase in his first and second year, followed by a precipitous loss in his third and fourth year.
If we really need the example,
let me finish. If we
didn't need the example, just make your point, man.
What do you mean? The point is, you would look at that data and say, "Oh my God, this was a disaster." When I think we could all see that's not the case.
You remember the very first point that I brought up when you very first brought this up? Do you remember what that point was? Where I said when you were looking at the total emissions, which you are trying to do, it is not informative because those numbers are so multivariate that you can't disentangle them and contribute any increase or decrease to one individual person. Okay.
Well, that seems.
So what I'm doing is I'm looking at the specific regulations that Trump rolled back and looking at how that affects greenhouse emissions with those regulations in place versus not having those regulations in place. I showed you those numbers and you rejected those numbers. That data you rejected because you said, "Oh, okay, that's not real data. That's just that's just speculation from scientists. That's not real."
Okay, so
you
just
want to focus on just these one particular year comparisons because you're cherry picking the data to try to construct your narrative.
Okay, so just to be clear, that if those estimates would end up being off, even by 1%, you would eat crow and you would say, "My God, I was wrong. This wasn't data. It was an estimate." That's what you would say, correct? "I was wrong. I'm sorry. We were talking about actual data that could be measured, and I brought up estimates that I falsely said was data." Mm-hmm. That's what you would say if those numbers ended up being incorrect, correct?
Not if they were incorrect by 1%, but if they were incorrect by like a significant portion that was outside of the margin of error of the estimate, then yeah, I would.
Let me ask you this, and I have much more to say on this specifically, which I'm assuming you won't have a problem with since this is your area of expertise. Did Biden's team immediately roll back the policies that Trump's EPA put in?
Some of them, yeah. They've rolled back a lot of them.
So you think that the EPA under Trump did very poorly. How would you rate it under Biden?
Better, for sure. But I mean, it's a mixed bag. They're doing what they can, but they're also beholden to corporate interests.
Okay, so can you give me some of the regulations that they re-put back in that Trump's EPA rolled out? And can you tell me roughly what year those were? An
example was about methane leaks from oil infrastructure. So like basically in the pipes that transport gas, there were like huge methane leaks coming out of that. And so the EPA put in regulations that were specifically to monitor those leaks and reduce the methane that's leaking out of that equipment. Okay. And it reduced it by like a significant percentage.
So Trump rolled that back. Trump's EPA rolled
that was never in place. The Biden EPA put those regulations in place.
Okay, so
like
my question...
there were specific regulations about methane emissions, not the same ones that Biden's EPA put in place, but there were methane emission regulations that Trump's administration did roll back.
Okay, so just to be clear, so you can't give me an example of one that Trump rolled back that Biden reinstituted. You're giving me a specific one that Biden instituted that had never been done before, and you're saying that's good.
Okay, there's one specifically about waste disposal for coal plants that Trump's EPA rolled back that then had negative health impacts on Americans that then Biden then put back in. I don't know the exact...
Yeah, you don't have to give me the name or anything, but you understand my position. If your argument's like, there's all these things that protected us here, Trump's team comes in and removes these things, then Biden's team comes in and says, no, let's put those back in. And there's a reason I asked this specifically because...
Yes, that has happened.
Okay, listen.
Waste disposal.
Okay, great. I'm not asking for like the specific date, the specific name of the bill, none of that shit. I'm asking you as someone that is unaware of these specific legislation. I'm willing to take your word for it. But the reason this is going to matter is if we go back and look at that estimate, can you put that back up? The estimate data?
Yeah, let me find it. Sharing the screen. Okay, here's their figure number 2 with the estimate.
Okay, so now what I'm seeing here is...
And they have kind of really terrible font colors, but their total, when you add it all up, is 209 million metric tons of CO2.
But when is this? Data is based on 2025 estimates. So when was this specifically taken? 2018? Data is based on 2018 estimated reductions. Wait a minute. Go back to the top, slide up a little. What is this even measuring? Estimated
So-
foregone. So what this is saying is that in 2018 there were regulations that were rolled back by I'm just going to say this, you tell me if I'm reading this wrong. There were regulations that from 2017 to 2018 when this study was done that Trump's EPA rolled back. And so they're now doing this estimate of this is how many emissions we think by the year 2025 will be increased because of these regulations that were rolled back. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay, so for example, with clean cars, this is not methane, by the way. This is just CO2, right?
This is CO2 or CO2 equivalents, I think. So
okay, so then my question is, how many did they predict since this data was in 2018, and we can see that this is suggesting this is what it'll look like by 2025?
If you're asking me to fact check this data based on the data that we have up to this point, I don't have that analysis ready to go for you right now live, but I think it would be a fun exercise that we could maybe do after this, and then we could post the results. But I think that would be something that live right now.
I think that would be something to be interested to look at to get an idea for the accuracy of this. Because if you can't give me, for example, regulations on clean cars that Trump rolled back, if Biden never reinstituted them, then we would have an apples to apples comparison to see how correct this estimate would have been. Mm-hmm. Does it look like that there's been a spike in these emissions even during the Biden administration? Do you think it looks like that?
I think that comparatively that we did see a spike in these emissions, but you're right, after the pandemic those have started to trend down because obviously there was a huge disruption in human activity during the pandemic that is going to mess up with our emissions numbers. So
but many times people say oftentimes that actually, particularly with fossil fuels and things like that, that there was an increase of use once the lockdown sort of ended. So if anything, although you're right that we would have seen a glut of those in 2021, maybe going into 2022, surely now in 2022, 2023, those numbers would be equal or higher than the normal usage of things like automobiles, electricity, etc.
I think that we might be getting lost in the weeds a little bit. I just want to make my overarching point with this is that Trump, who has said before that he thinks climate change is a hoax, is not going to be good for addressing climate change.
So that's very unscientific what you're doing now. I love this. You're someone who should be an expert on these charts and the data, right? And you're the one making the affirmative claim. Trump will be a disaster for the environment. And I'm like, well, let's look at his previous term. And you're like, yes, it was a disaster because of these things at the EPA. We look at the specific data. The data seems to show that net, he was better than Obama, and that he left just with methane emissions. I don't think that's
what the data shows.
Okay, go back to the methane
data because go back to the methane.
Go back to the methane chart.
The data that you want to quote is too multivariate to be drawing the types of conclusions that you're trying to draw from it. I keep making that point, and you keep doing it anyway, Rob.
No, that's incorrect. So what you're doing is you're conflating two things, right? And I'll answer the multivariate thing as well. When we're talking about the way things are, right? What does the data say? I am correct when I make this statement that net, it was lower on average under Trump than it was under Biden or Obama, correct? Yes or no?
In terms of the total absolute value of greenhouse gas emissions? I believe that is correct.
Okay, and methane, correct?
I think in total, for all across the board, but I think again that is just going off of global trends that a lot of the things were put in place by the Obama administration, like the Paris Climate Accords that he got us into. And by the way, I'm not a fan of Obama either. So
okay, it doesn't matter if you're a fan or not. So
I just want to make sure that that point is said because I'm not just saying that because I'm an Obama fan. Like I'm not a big Obama fan, and I'm still saying that.
But what we're saying, it seems just you're suggesting there's something uniquely bad with Trump running the EPA, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so then I think it would be fair to compare to other presidents around Trump. That seems reasonable, even if you weren't the biggest fan of them. If you're saying that this is a unique threat, right? So this isn't the way things are normally done, which will be uniquely bad, right? So what I'm saying is, when we look at the actual data, we could see that those things were better under Trump on average than they were under Obama.
No.
Yes. Go to the methane.
You're just saying better now. You're changing it, right?
Bring up the methane chart.
Earlier we said absolute values, and now you're just saying one's better or worse.
No.
You're not looking at percent change, increase, overall trends. You're only looking at this absolute value and then making a statement like better or worse.
Bring up the methane chart. Bring up the methane chart.
I might have closed out of the methane chart. I'll try to pull up a.
Okay.
I'll try to find another chart here. But
why don't we look at the same chart we were looking at?
Look at the trends of, is it going up? Is it going down? I think that the data that you're trying to use is insufficient for the conclusions you're trying to draw from it. That's my issue.
I'm looking at a chart right now. It shows U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by major emitting sector from 2005 to 2023.
You want to share your screen?
Yeah, can I do that? Let's see if I can figure that out.
It's at the
I
bottom.
don't use StreamYards.
It's at the bottom where it says present with a little plus.
Here we go. Sometimes this happens to me. I lose my mouse cursor. I don't know if you ever had that happen. Let's see if I can find
yeah, it's okay.
Present.
And then I did eventually maybe want to get on to the other subjects like with the human rights or foreign policy.
Well, this is great stuff. Well,
I agree, but yeah, I mean, we don't have all night, you know. Okay, here we go.
Can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
Now, do you see that it looks like from 2005 to 2023, it looks like, with the exception of the transportation sector, which is pretty flatlined, goes up just a little under Trump, all these other industries, it seems to be either flatlined or going down, such as the power industry, which we can see went down significantly. It looks under the Trump years, right? So the point I'm trying to make is, net, it seems like all of these emissions were lower under the Trump years. Now, okay,
well,
can I stop sharing screen? Are you cool with that?
Do you think that it could have to do with the fact that under the Obama years, they started ramping up solar and wind capacity in the country that only then came online during the Trump years when he wasn't in a position to stop it?
Well, so let me finish, right? So first, to answer this point specifically on multivariance, it would seem to suggest if there are all these external factors that mean that the specific policies of the EPA, we can't look at just the net numbers. That's what you're suggesting, right? We can't look at the actual data, right? Because there's all these other variants that could suggest why the data did what it did. Not just...
I'm not saying don't look at the data. I'm just saying don't look at the final top of the line total number because that's too multivariate.
Okay, so if the point is, and so the argument would be, it's not just what's being regulated at the EPA. There could be all sorts of other factors. For example, here could be a factor, just general, without government intervention whatsoever, increased in technology. So maybe some university somewhere gets a better solar technology or better tidal technology, whatever. All of these things could exist as externalities outside of EPA regulations, correct?
Yeah, and also on that point, did you hear about the innovation in nuclear fusion that happened a couple years ago? The first time that they ever got more power out than they put in. It's really funny how that happened because that program was shut down under the Trump administration because he took away their funding, and they were only able to start trial runs again during the Biden administration when their funding was restored so that they can then turn on their nuclear fusion machine, which they couldn't even turn on under Trump because he took away their funding for scientific innovations.
Okay, so anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that if you say that we can't just look at the actual, or that it's not the end-all be-all to just look at the actual raw numbers of how much emissions declined, because they did decline under Trump.
Yeah.
And in fact, in some ways, it seems that they declined at a rate that was similar or better than Obama, that they were declining.
Not borne out by the data.
Okay, can we go back to that methane chart?
I'll find it again, Rob. I know you like the methane chart. I'll go find it.
Well, it seems like the trend of those last 2 years was more precipitously going down than any
it literally changed from 7. It was like 1 point. If you actually crunch the numbers, what you just said is not accurate. But I will try to find this chart that I just had. Let me go to my recently closed tabs.
It seems similar to during the Obama years.
I don't think that the actual data bears that out when you look at a percentage change.
So we can see
I'm
that...
pulling it back up again. Here we go. Okay. So you've got Obama here. And again, the entire stream at this point is just a debate on this chart. But okay, it's 875 at the start of Obama, and then it drops down to 796.
So it goes like 80. Yeah, I'll give you, it looks better.
And then under Trump, it's 796 to 795.
Okay, so yeah. So you're right that it went down more under the Obama years than Trump. But the rate of the last 2 years looks like it was similar, if not better, than the average rate during the Obama years. Though it does particularly seem like, I don't know, what was going on in 2010 to 11? Seems
this
like
is also a great point. Do you understand the concept of lagging indicators?
So that would be that... Correct me if I'm wrong, that oftentimes the policies we see, we don't see the net effects of till a couple years later or a year or two later.
Exactly. So yeah, you do understand the concept.
That's a great point for me. How are things looking? How are things looking under those Biden years with the lagging indicators of policies we saw under Trump? Oh, they're declining even more. So when we first see, so if we're, that's a great point. It's great. So why don't we go to
Rob? I don't think that you're being honest here because you know that Biden also passed some of the most progressive climate legislation of any president ever. So like,
What's the point? The point we're trying to make here isn't what policies Biden passed. We're saying that the policies that were instituted or the regulations that were rolled back when Trump was there was a disaster for, in this case, methane emissions, right? And so what we see is the worst years for Trump was his first year and his second year. When you bring up lagging indicators, how much effect would his policies have had year one? It seems more likely that that would be a lagging indicator, which you just said. Don't you understand lagging indicators? Wouldn't that seem to be that the policies from 2016 that would have been instituted under Obama would have more effect on the indicators of raw numbers in 2017?
So Rob, you would understand that that would be dependent on the policy. Some policies are going to have immediate effects, and other policies are not. Surely we can agree about that, right?
Well,
if you have a policy that just instantly cuts methane emissions because it changes the type of fitting between your pipes, that's going to have an immediate impact, and it's going to have a long-term impact, right? There's going to be different time frames, and
how convenient? How convenient from the perspective of someone that says, "Let's look at the raw data." Oh, don't you understand about lagging indicators? You would surely realize that many of the policies that Trump rolled back. Would you agree with this? Let's say Trump rolls back a policy on car emissions, vehicle emissions. Okay, you got that? Or on power plant emissions, whatever. He rolls back a regulation on one of those. Chances are you wouldn't see the effects of that for a year or two, correct? It's not going to be immediate because even if once the law changes, it's going to take some time for the specific power plants or the specific vehicle manufacturers to change how they're manufacturing vehicles, correct?
Yeah, or like what he specifically rolled back about those coal plants dumping in local streams. That's going to take a while for those toxic chemicals to start building up to harmful levels. So that's going to start having an effect down the line, not immediately.
Okay. So what did you say, like 2 years it would take before we really start to see an impact?
I don't know. I wouldn't be able to give you a number.
But you would agree that it's going to be some length of time. It's not going to be like the next day. It wouldn't be fair for me to go test those levels 2 days after the rollback and say, see, no change. That would be horseshit. Yeah. We both agree with that. So then the problem is this lagging indicator thing is actually going to be worse for you because what it shows is the worst years of Trump were the first 2 years. And then we can see that once they would have started rolling back regulations year one, year two, that we would most likely not see the effects of those until Trump like year 3, year 4, which we could see that there was a precipitous decline. And we would also expect to see the policies that Trump instituted year 3 and year 4 then show up during the Biden administration. Like, even if he re-put those regulations in, you would still not expect those regulations to have an immediate effect on emissions because it would take these companies time to start complying with the regulations. Okay. So let me finish this point real quick. So
can you address the multivariate thing? Because that's going to be my response to everything that you just said. Right. Is that it's too many factors to conclude what you're concluding. So can you just address that part?
Yes. So I will address the multivariate thing. So then what you're saying is that because there are other factors, such as ones we talked about, there could be a breakthrough scientifically that has nothing to do with Trump or his administration. Just some scientist somewhere in Kansas comes up with some great biofuel. Right?
Probably not Kansas, but yeah.
You see what I'm saying? What is that? Yeah. A little bigotry there? Little high-ed bigotry? What's wrong with the fine scientists in Kansas? I find them to be fantastic people. Nonetheless.
They're great at mosasaur research, but not green energy alternatives.
Switchgrass? I knew a scientist from Kansas that was heavily invested in researching switchgrass. How about that?
Makes sense. They have a strong agricultural science program. I'm saying they're good in certain areas. They're not great at green energy.
So when I say biofuel, it would be entirely reasonable that it's someone working in agriculture like Kansas that might be able to have a breakthrough in that, correct?
Okay, Rob. If you want to dig it into my snide remark, you can.
I'm just fucking with you, but I'm saying I find the state I picked to be entirely reasonable with the specific thing that I said. Nonetheless.
I mean, Rob, I literally went to the University of Oklahoma, so I know that good science is done in rural red states, okay? I get it.
Okay, so point being, right, when talking specifically about this, there are other factors, so we wouldn't be able to just look at the raw data. My point to you would be, it seems then when you're admitting that looking at the raw data and how it went down under Trump, we can't really use that much because of multivariates. What that seems to suggest to me is that these EPA regulations aren't that important. Because if you're saying that, if you're saying that it was such a disaster under Trump, and yet the data doesn't bear that out, The data suggests, despite what you would have said at the time, each of these specific regulation rollbacks, I can imagine if me and you have like a weekly show, you would be like, holy shit, this is going to be a disaster. Wait until you see a year or two from now. You're going to see these emissions skyrocket. But then we didn't. And when we don't, you're like, well, that's because there's other factors at play. And so it wasn't just this regulation. Okay, then it seems to suggest that you saying that Trump's going to be a unique threat because, oh my goodness, he's going to appoint someone to the EPA that'll roll back regulations seems to not bear out to be true for the very reason that you're giving. Because it's only a small part and there's multivariants. And so therefore we'll still be safe, just like we were in the first 4 years under Trump, where we saw actually emissions decrease.
This is a very interesting rhetorical strategy, but I just don't think that it actually makes logical sense if you think about it even a little bit, right? Because just look at any one of these regulations and what specifically they are rolling back. It cannot be argued that this does not lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions.
Show me. Give me a specific one that Trump did that led to methane emissions being disastrously increased.
Okay, we've got some people in the chat that have been posting tons of them.
Cool. Read like five, okay? And just now listen. Just read the name of them and the year that they were implemented.
Okay.
Sure.
Trump rolled back most of the requirements of a 2017 rule aimed at improving safety at sites that use hazardous chemicals that was instituted after a chemical plant exploded in Texas. Is one.
2017.
You can also see. Trump changed safety rules that allow for rail transport of highly flammable liquefied natural gases.
2, got it. How many you got?
Overturning a ban on the use of lead ammunition and fishing tackle on federal lands.
Cool.
We've got weakening a rule aimed to limit toxic discharge from power plants into public waterways.
4.
We've got lifting a Clinton-era ban on logging and road construction in the Tongass in Alaska. Okay. So that's a huge carbon sink.
Gotcha. 5. You can keep going if you want. We'll do them all.
Trump withdrew a requirement that Gulf oil rig owners prove that they can cover the cost of removing rigs once they stop producing. Cool. I mean, are you going to seriously try to make the case that these regulation rollbacks are not resulting in an increased amount of greenhouse gas emissions?
I'm saying despite those rollbacks, we have not seen a drastic increase in emissions that would be a disaster for this country or the world, as you claimed would happen. Let me finish. We don't have to guess. You just outlined quite a few things from.
I didn't claim, by the way. I did not claim what you just said I claimed.
Okay, then what's your claim? Why would it be such a disaster?
Okay, right. So I want to make this clear because I made this point initially. I thought you understood it, but now I'm not so sure of that, right? Because without rolling back these regulations, say we drop 100 points of greenhouse gas emissions. I'm making up the units. I'm making up the number.
No problem. I get what you're saying.
Now, say that we roll back those regulations and we only drop 80 points.
Gotcha.
Right? So you see, that's the comparison. In both cases, greenhouse gas emissions dropped. So your argument applies in both cases. My argument, though, is that they dropped more when we still had those regulations in place, which is better.
That's not what your argument was. And let me explain.
My argument. When I showed you, remember that 200 number that I showed you? That is the argument.
That's not the argument, and I'll explain to you why that wasn't your argument. Because your argument wasn't that Trump's team will do good but less good. Your argument was that Trump's team would be a disaster and that it was a disaster the first time. That would imply that it's making the situation worse, not making the situation better more slowly.
That is worse.
That's not worse.
I disagree with your framing here because the argument that you're saying I'm not making is the argument that I've been making this entire time. That's what that 200 number, that was the only initial number that I quoted to you. That's what that 200 number represents, is that difference between 80 and 20. That's the number that I gave you. Okay,
so
that was always been my argument this entire time. And I'm saying that it's not just that it's less good. It is bad. It is a disaster to reduce it by less.
Okay, so I just want to be clear. When you suggest that Trump's term this time could be a disaster, like the way you would quantify a disaster is even if emissions decrease, they could have decreased more if we had a different president. That's your argument?
That was exactly my argument.
Okay, yeah. Well then I would suggest that the way you define disaster is completely erroneous because that wouldn't be a disaster. That is still gradual improvement that would be good, and the idea that somehow there's going to be this tipping point if we only decrease things 20% instead of 20 units instead of 80 units, and that's going to lead to these unmitigated disasters is unwarranted. It's not true. And so
here's
when
what the disaster is, right? The disaster is climate change, okay? Like, we're barreling towards that future.
I don't believe that.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, but you got to explain stratospheric cooling then.
Sure.
If you can't, I don't know, because I'm not aware of any other explanation for stratospheric cooling other than the greenhouse gas effect.
Okay, so it's not. So let me explain what happens with climate change, right? There is a consensus that the climate is changing. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
There is a consensus. Now, the term consensus is weird. When I say it, I'm saying like 95% of the people that study this stuff agree. Is that fair? I don't mean 100%. You could obviously find one person.
Yes.
So when I say consensus, I'm not trying to be a dick about it, right? So there's also a consensus that humans have something to do with climate change, correct? You would agree with that. That's basically where the consensus ends. Like, for example, let me ask you this. By what point would we reach if emissions continue at a trend that we're expecting right now, at what point would we be beyond the point of no return? Is there a consensus?
That there would never be a consensus on that because you could always have some sort of technology that reverses it in the future.
Absolutely true. Actually, you've made the greatest point why these models suck, because they never understand human ingenuity, right? For example,
but that's not something to bank on. I'm not just going to bank on technology.
Let me explain this. So, for example, when I was debating in 2003, 2004 in college, one of the topics one year was the United States should sign on to one of these treaties. One of the treaties was called the Kyoto Protocol. Did you ever hear of this?
I have.
The Kyoto Protocol said that all the signees would reduce emissions by 20% by the year 2020. Right? Does that sound familiar? Something like that. I think I'm getting the specifics on that, right? The United States did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. It was very similar. It was sort of the beginning of a Paris Climate Accord type agreement, right? And yet, despite the fact that we didn't sign that, would you be shocked to know that the United States did, in fact, reduce their emissions 20% by the year 2020? Without signing it. Now, I was told, and people were reading credible evidence from scientists that said, without signing this accord and then instituting drastic policies to punish fossil fuels and completely curb the amount of fossil fuels, we'll never make this emission reduction, and that would be a disaster for the planet. And it turned out they were absolutely incorrect, because what they didn't take into effect was we didn't immediately need to collapse our economy by having something like a 40% reduction in fossil fuel usage. Instead, we were able to gradually, through ingenuity and other policies, ensure that we had a gradual change that met the goals that they were suggesting without having a disastrous effect to the economy. The people that talk about these radical things, like, oh, we need to radically curb fossil fuel emissions, etc., all of these policies would directly harm the lowest class people, particularly in a country like the United States. It will be
I don't really think you can be talking about that.
Absolutely, I can. Why not? For example, if we all pay...
His policies would directly harm all of the...
That's not true. For example, let's say, for example, that we say that we're going to limit the consumption of fossil fuels in this country by 20%. Yes. That would lead to an increase in prices of energy. So just say...
If it was indiscriminate, sure, or it could be targeted.
So how would you target that? So, for example, we say all coal plants now...
You change the regulations surrounding private jet travel.
So your argument is the coal plant, where the vast bulk of our energy is coming from, you wouldn't do anything to change them. You would just change regulations. The bulk of our
energy is not coming from coal.
Where's the bulk of our energy coming from?
I mean, in terms of a single source, probably oil, but it's not coal.
For like electricity?
Yeah.
Let me look this up.
Sure, you can. I don't really think it's very pertinent, but... Like, the point overall that you're trying to make is such that poor people will be the most adversely affected by overall energy reduction, like energy use reductions, which I agree with. Like, I'm not saying that you just indiscriminately stop the total amount of energy use. Like, you can regulate it so that people that are unnecessarily burning energy for things like flying to a Taylor Swift concert or something can be regulated.
No, wait, I'm just curious, right? Because you're making declarative claims. So far, I caught you in... Perhaps it was a misunderstanding on my part, but the idea when I asked you specifically if these emissions dropped under Trump, you said no, and then you were like, well, you were talking about estimates. So as someone who researches this heavily, do you have any idea where what leads to the majority of our electricity production?
You're telling me that it's coal?
No, I'm asking you specifically. I was guessing that it's coal. It's not. It wasn't until
Natural
2016.
gas?
It is natural gas, but you didn't know
Okay.
that.
All right. That makes sense to me.
It's just, it seems odd that someone with your expertise, like, seems to be pretty vague about specifics on these.
My expertise is not in energy production.
Okay, nonetheless, the point is that if you were going to have this,
Just Rob, just FYI, my expertise is in biochemistry. Just so you know.
well, I mean your expertise in what you claim to be debating. It seems like you've debated sort of climate change quite frequently.
I have one climate change debate on my channel.
Fair enough. I misunderstood.
Most of it is against young Earth creationism. I argue like about evolution, the Big Bang, abiogenesis. I argue against flat earthers with physics and relativity. That kind of thing is my typical wheelhouse.
Okay, so the point is, right? Yes, what would happen would be, it's no one suggesting just regulate. For example, the regulations that Trump rolled back that you seem to have a problem with, none of them were regulations specifically on private jet usage. Like you were, the ones you read were talking about transportation of energy.
Yeah,
right?
They don't go far enough in terms of the regulations for me. I got
But
you.
the point I'm trying to make is, oftentimes with these regulations are no one's suggesting, oh, we're just going to limit private jet usage. That's it. That's our policy. That's not what like the Democrats in Congress that are
But
suggesting.
you're trying to say that these economic regulations have a disproportionate negative impact on the poorest Americans.
Yes, you disagree?
Again, I think that some do and some don't. It depends on your targeting, and you can have regulations that do have meaningful impact that don't have a disproportionate effect on poor people that are targeted. That was my point when I brought up private jet regulations.
Okay, so Biden's team instituted specific regulations, correct? That you were a fan of. Can you give me an example of one of them that was only targeted to the wealthy?
I'm not sure which ones I'd be able to bring up. I think most of them were specifically targeted at the fossil fuel industry.
Right. And the cheap energy, including from things in fossil fuels like natural gas, oil, etc., that affects poor people more than it does wealthy people. Let me give you an example. Stephen Colbert famously said, I don't care if gasoline goes $15 to a gallon. Of course he doesn't care. But my neighbors that live paycheck to paycheck, they can't afford that. So the problem is, it's the same problem with inflation. Like, no matter how rich you get, unless you're talking about private jets, you're only going to drive so much. You're only going to pay.
Then why don't we talk about Trump's pro-inflationary policies?
Well, we could move on to that at some point if you want, but I just want to make clear, I don't think you've done a sufficient job at showing why, when it comes to regulations, particularly from the EPA, that it's going to lead to a grotesque increase in emissions that would be a disaster. And I feel that I've even got you to admit that that's not what you're suggesting. You're suggesting that it would lead to a slower decline in emissions. You're also suggesting
when I say increase in emissions and when you say increase emissions, I think we're being too ambiguous. When I say increase in emissions, the comparison, the baseline that I'm comparing to is a world without Trump doing these things. The baseline that you're comparing to is the start of Trump's presidency. We have different baselines of comparison. When we say increase, it means increase relative to what?
Right. So relative to what we see that has occurred.
So I'm saying increase relative to a world without Trump being
president. But you
president.
have no way of knowing that. You're guessing what it would be with Trump without president.
You can calculate the impacts of these regulations, what effects they will have.
But we could see that under a Trump term, the first term that you're saying was a disaster, that he was less than the previous. He ended with less
what argument have I been making against this all night that you have still not?
That it's multivariate, which shows that the specific policies that a president or the EPA illustrates isn't the end-all be-all. That there were other things that happened that ended up lowering emissions.
Sure, yeah, but I feel like you're using that to try to minimize the effect that these things have. Just because there are multiple variables that are contributing to a final outcome doesn't mean that changing one or two variables won't have an impact or isn't important.
But it didn't have an impact on the raw data that we were seeing. It actually still led to a decline in emissions.
You don't know that, Rob.
No, we do know that.
No, you don't.
Yes, we do.
You are claiming that it didn't have an impact on the raw data we were seeing, but you are not comparing. The basis that you're comparing to is not a valid control in any scientific sense.
That's outrageous. We could see, like, if I could see that 10,000, what's the unit that they used again? I forget this specific.
1 million metric tons.
10 million metric tons on average were there under Obama, and under Trump it was 9.9 million metric tons that were put in on average a year. I could say there is data that I'm looking at that shows that there was a decrease. The speed at which we were emitting decreased.
Yeah,
you're
you
saying
can use data to lie if you want.
It's not lying. That's true.
Okay, but
that's true.
You have to disentangle the causative factors behind the data.
That's not true.
Hey, what if it was a policy that was put in place 5 years beforehand? That's
but listen, the problem is, and it's someone. Do you have a degree in science?
Yes.
Okay, so you'll understand this. Data exists, right? You could objectively see raw data. We could argue as to what influenced that data, correct?
Sure, yeah,
so as a scientist,
scientist,
we could look at something like a specific person and their cholesterol levels. And you could say, you came in this month and this is what your cholesterol was. And then the next month you came in and your cholesterol was increased. So me and you as two scientists could look at that and say, that's a truth. We can see that that cholesterol increased. We may disagree as to why. We might say, well, here's the factors that I think led, and you would say, I
we
disagree.
agree on this point, Rob.
Right. So the point I'm trying to say is I'm looking at the actual data, which to me is what matters most. Not hypothetical if we guess what it would have been if Trump's not there. Not, oh, you're lying because while the data says that, I disagree as to how much Trump's policies had to do with that.
What matters is the causes of the data.
No, I completely disagree. When discussing the outcome at the end of the day of what this data will mean for our world, for our country.
If I showed you data that showed that there were more sunny days under a Biden administration, there were more rainy days under a Trump administration. And I'm just saying, hey, I'm just looking at the data, man. The causes behind that data don't matter at all. I'm just saying, if you like sunny weather, vote for Biden. You would understand that that's a terrible, nonsensical analysis.
No, and I'll explain
what you're doing.
No, I'll explain what you're doing and why your argument's nonsensical. My argument to that would be, but wait a minute. There's multivariance in why there'd be sunny days or rainy days, right? And it's absurd to say that Biden's policies led to that. You would agree with that, right?
Yeah, it's not just Biden's policies that make in the weather.
Right, and so then I would expect you to then finish the argument by saying, oh, well then, Rob, when you said Biden's so bad because of rainy days, that was bullshit because it turned out his policies weren't the end-all be-all of that because there's so much multivariance. Yes, that would be correct. That's the exact position we're arguing here in the inverse. You're saying that Trump would be such a disaster, but the outcome that matters is what will these emissions look like? That's what we're concerned with. When we say, well, why would emissions be bad? What we're suggesting isn't the reasons that the emissions go up or down. What we're saying is, at the end of the day, if emissions are at this level, bad shit will happen. And so when we look and we see that those emissions are decreasing under what you called a disastrous presidency, and then when you say, well, that's because of other factors, hypothetically.
Rob, hold on, man.
Let me finish real quick. One, you don't know what all those other factors are, and you're going to look at it with rose-colored glasses saying, well, my side always does better than your side. And secondly, then it seems to suggest that because there's so much multivariance, that the EPA decisions under Trump weren't such a disaster.
Right. You made that point. Okay, look, the reason why you extending my analogy makes it no longer analogous in the way that you're trying to use it is because we can both agree that there are policies of a presidential administration that do absolutely have an effect on greenhouse gas emissions. We can both agree that there are policies that are going to have an effect, but we don't agree that there are going to be policies of a U.S. president that are going to affect the number of sunny or rainy days, right?
That's not true. There could be.
Like what, man?
Cloud seeding.
Okay. So then there you go. Then I would know. Then if you want to go with that, then your analogy would be analogous again. Then we could say, oh, well, look, if your argument was that Trump is bad because of the more rainy days, and I could point to policies of cloud seeding showing that is the case, like I can with rollbacks of EPA protections increasing greenhouse gas emissions, which I showed you in that report, which you rejected.
That's not what that report said.
The 200 million.
That's not what it said. You just
number?
Misspoke. It did not say there would be an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. It said that there would be
an increase compared to not. That
there would be a loss of decrease.
Okay, when I say increase, I'm talking about that 100 versus 80.
Well, that's an inaccurate term. What you mean is a loss of decrease.
To me, that's an increase because it's an increase relative to the other case.
But that's not how normal people speak. If you say greenhouse gas,
it's very normal language, Rob.
That's not true.
I were to say that, like,
if I asked 100 people, if I said the phrase greenhouse gas emissions increased under Trump, do you think they would interpret that as A, the amount went up when Trump was in office than compared to before, or do you think they would think B, well, the amount in total went down, but they went up compared to what it would have been if Trump wasn't in office? What do you think the average person would think?
I don't know, but here's
don't be disingenuous. You know what they would think.
I really don't, actually.
So I just want to be, wait. This is a greater point.
Let you talk, Rob. Come on now. I'm saying that if next week I owe $100 and then somebody helps me out so that next week I only owe $80, then my total net worth went up $20. That's a $20 increase.
Okay.
That's the way I'm thinking about this.
That's not analogous at all what we're talking about.
That's the way I think about finance. That's the way
you don't think that you're being disingenuous when if I went to someone and said, hey, greenhouse gas emissions increased under Trump, that 99 out of 100 of them would think, oh, that means there were more greenhouse gas emissions under Trump than before him. You don't think that's what they'd think? They would in their head go, oh, that probably means that greenhouse gas emissions went down, but it went up compared to what I think it would have been had Trump not been in office. That's what you think most people would think? That's absurd.
It's equivalent, to be honest. I think it's
absurd.
Equivalent.
It's an absurd argument. And I think it goes to show bias that you have.
Are increasing by 200 million metric tons. It doesn't matter whether that 200 million metric tons is being added on top or is being subtracted from a further reduction. It's a net increase of 200 million metric tons either way you cut it. I really think that we are so deep into the weeds now, and we've gone so off the deep rails that we've spent an hour and a half on one of my 3 points, and we haven't gotten to any of the human rights.
We could move on if you want to put a bow on this. We could both give closing statements on this. We'll move on to the next thing. Totally fine with that.
I mean, yeah, I would like to move on because
you want to give a minute closing statement. You want to give a minute closing statement on this, or do you want me to go first, or do you not want to do closing statement on? What do you think? I would like to give a minute.
I don't really care about closing statements. If you want to have one,
I'll take a minute closing statement. Then we can move on. Then, if that's suffice to you.
If you have a minute, I'll have a minute after you.
You want to go second? That's smart. Got it. Okay. So it's clear to see the idea that this would be a disaster. What we're concerned about when it comes to emissions specifically is what those raw data of emissions would be. Not that, we could have reduced it more hypothetically, says a bunch of partisan people that don't like Trump and don't like these regulations in the first place, had they not been rolled back. He admitted that he thought the 2016 Trump administration was a disaster when it came to emissions, but compared to the data, we saw that there was actually a net decrease in the amount that we were putting out every year. It wasn't the disaster they claimed. He makes mistakes by talking about sort of the lag that would occur with this data, but we could see that actually the worst years under Trump would have been the lag years from Obama, and we can see that they precipitously went down from 2018 even before COVID. Things weren't that bad, and the idea that this would be such a disaster is a joke. The climate change people do this all the time. It's not that they're not correct that there is climate change, it's that they make it this hyperbolic apocalyptic scenario, and the policies always would screw over poor and working class people, such as those that we see in institutions or plans like the Green New Deal. So he hasn't made his case whatsoever. He's done a very poor job. He's tried to have duplicitous language and said, when I talk about increase, I mean if Trump wasn't there and the estimates of what that hypothetically could have been. The truth is it wasn't that bad under Trump. Emissions still went down. It's likely that we'll roll back burdensome regulations this time that will be a boon to the economy. There is multivariance, which means that there will still be technological advancements, which will continue to lead to the reductions of these emissions, which means the disastrous effects that we've told the apocalyptic scenarios of climate change aren't going to happen, and we'll have more economic viability as opposed to burdensome regulations that disproportionately hurt the poor and working class.
Okay, so I think that this was a very good case study in the kind of arrogance of the average Trump supporter, right? Because Rob started this by talking about how, casting doubts about whether the experts really are the experts. He was saying, if somebody is an expert, they're probably just grown up in this sort of propaganda mill of academia or whatever. You can't trust what they're saying. He started by casting aspersions and doubts on the expertise of experts. And I think that this is incredibly emblematic of the kind of science denial that we typically see in the MAGA movement, because after saying this, Rob looks at one chart and then thinks that he is capable of understanding all the nuance of this chart. I see that he picked up on a word I might have introduced to his vocabulary, multivariate. fun shout out in your conclusion there, adding that you almost used it, right? And then just the icing on the cake was the fact that he thinks that now he has looked at the data himself. He has drawn logical and informed conclusions from this data that he thinks that he is confident enough that he can draw his own conclusions and that they would be well informed and substantiated. He's not missing anything. There's nothing he's left out. There's no nuance or any confounding factors that he's not accounting for. He's looked at the data. He's concluded that he's right. The experts are simply ideologically captured. The experts are not looking at the data. He's looking at the data. Anything that the experts come out with, that's all just speculation. That's not borne out in the data. And it just speaks to the kind of overconfidence, arrogance, the skepticism towards expertise, and the overall air of pseudoscience that I see so often on the right, especially in regards to climate change, vaccine science, etc.
Hey, you know what? I'll concede totally. I don't know exactly what they were talking about. Can you go ahead and explain exactly what they were talking about? These experts? Go ahead.
Who's they?
That estimate, the one chart that you put out. Yeah. You're saying that I'm arrogantly saying I could read the chart. You're absolutely right. I don't know specifically what they were talking about. Can you articulate it?
The chart I was specifically talking about in making that statement was with those methane emissions charts where you're saying, oh, well, the lagging indicators would actually be from Obama's year.
Correct.
Hold that from your ass. You also were talking about, oh, well, the lagging indicators apply here and not here. You don't know
that's what you did. That's what you did.
No,
yes,
I did not.
You brought up the point when I was talking about when we look at the raw data, we can see that it decreased. It was lower when Trump left office than when he came in, right? And you said, you smugly brought up someone from your chat that said, Rob doesn't even know about lagging indicators. And I said, is this what you mean by lagging indicators? That it would often take a year or two to see the results of policies?
Yeah.
And you said, yes. And I said, okay, well, given that, seeing as how the worst years under Trump were his first 2 years, which would be more likely to see residual lagging indicators from the Obama years, and then we see it go down for the last 2 years, and then the next 2 years under Biden, we continue to see it go down.
Yes.
It would suggest that lagging indicators would be a stronger case for Trump's policies not being that bad.
This is the exact
and then you said, oh no, because now it has to do with specific. So I'm asking you, give me the specific things that Trump did that wouldn't be lagging indicators versus the things that Obama did that would be lagging indicators, and the things that Biden did that would be the opposite. Go ahead.
I already gave you examples in this talk, right?
No,
I gave you examples of things that would be rollbacks of regulations that would have a lagging indicator.
Give me an example of one of those.
I gave you others, such as the buildup of toxic waste in stream beds. That would be something that we would expect to have down-term lagging effects as those build up to threshold levels.
Can you give me?
I also gave you examples, Rob, of things that would have immediate effects. We've already been through
like
this.
What? Give me one of those. I forget those examples.
And you just did exactly what I accused you of cherry picking the data. I never said that everything can be explained by lagging indicators. That is a position you are putting on me. All I asked you was if you are aware of the concept of lagging indicators.
Yes.
I did not say or imply that the data was strictly explained by lagging indicators.
Okay, now, real quick. You said that you gave me examples of ones that would have lagging indicators. I agree. The 5 you showed seemed to, in my estimation of briefly looking at them, be ones that would have lagging indicators. You then said that you gave me examples of ones that would be immediate. Can you? I missed that. Can you tell me what those were?
His rollbacks of methane emission regulations, where previously it was regulated how much methane emissions a company was allowed to release. Those were rolled back. That has an immediate impact of increasing methane emissions in like 2017, 2018.
So he immediately in 2017 said you could release more in methane. And then these companies, that wouldn't be lagging. These companies immediately were like, great, we could completely change overnight how we do things. We could now... Yeah, I disagree. I think that would also have a lagging effect.
It can have both.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying is you seem to be
This is not mutually exclusive.
You seem to be wanting to have your cake and eat it too. Like
I'm just trying to introduce nuance.
No. Of course there's nuance. The problem is when we are looking at the raw data, we can see that actually there was a net decrease from when Trump came into office to when he came out. That's just looking at methane. I think the decrease was even more significant when it comes to greenhouse gas and carbon emissions in general. But nonetheless, you then start to institute all of these, but there's all these other variables. and there's lagging indicators we have to accept, and there's nuance. And what it comes to is you don't have any specifics. You're just doing the same thing that you're accusing me of doing. And you're basically just having this appeal to, you are. So
I'm not looking at the overall numbers. You're the one bringing up the totals. I'm looking at specifics. What will this specific rollback of legislation, how much even increase with a baseline of not having done that regulation? What is the increase in greenhouse gases? That is the initial number I sent you in that study using EPA data that you rejected, that you said was too speculative.
No, you don't. You did
going on.
You did not. You did not do that.
We both already gave our concluding statements, Rob. We already gave our concluding statements on this part.
That's fine. You didn't do that. I'll say this will be my last word. You didn't do that. You presented a chart that didn't give any specifics at all. It just said the shit that Trump did will lead to this by 2025. It didn't say, here's how much we expect year to year. It didn't say what those specific policies were. It just said, trust us, this is what it'll be. That's why I specifically asked you.
I
said,
say what specific policies they were.
Okay. What were they?
The Clean Power Plan is one of them. Like the safe vehicle rule draft. Like literally they did list the specific.
Okay. Did Biden reinstitute those regulations?
I don't know, Rob.
Okay, then how would we check for the accuracy of these predictions? Can you explain in your estimation, if we were trying to design, we're almost at 2025, we only got a couple more months. So surely these numbers, if Biden didn't reinstitute this plan, they're going to be remarkably accurate, correct?
You can look at how much would an average car emit with these regulations in place versus without these regulations.
That's not true.
You can do this on a per car level.
That's not true. For example, could the automobile industry trend to having less emissions even if there wasn't a regulation demanding that?
Again, this is how a scientific experiment is done, is that you have a control, Rob. We're saying all things equal, what is the difference between an individual car with this regulation in place versus without this regulation in place? There's a control done to eliminate other variables.
But you're incorrect, because what we're dealing with is an estimate. This is a projection. This isn't the same as looking at logic. But that's not how science works. It's not. Well, they
do calculate and estimate things in science.
Let me finish. It's not how science works that we says these scientists did a calculation. That's it. It's 100% accurate, guaranteed. They did a calculation. That's it. We can't question it now. And so if they say by 2025, this is how things will look, and then we look at 2025 and we go, no, it doesn't look like that at all. You would say, no, it has to. They did a calculation. What we would say is that calculation is... Please, let me finish. Calculations can be fallible.
You said you were going to make your last point, and now you're still making more points.
You keep making points to rebut, which I'm rebutting your points.
Right? We're supposed to give a concluding, and I was supposed to have the final conclusion. That's what we agreed to.
I understand the fact that you don't want to talk about this because you aren't able to defend this.
Because I wanted to.
I want you to find, if you're right that these estimates were correct, we're almost at 2025. Find those numbers. Send them to me. Post them to your audience that show.
45 minutes ago, when we already agreed to that, Rob.
I don't remember you saying I'm going to post these numbers to my channel or to you.
I said that we're going to figure out this and then we're going to post them. I agreed to that 45 minutes ago, Rob.
Okay, and just so you know, if they're wildly inaccurate, you're going to say, my God, I used a bad estimate. The experts were wrong.
Wildly inaccurate, Rob. Okay, look, the reason why I'm trying to move the conversation on is not because I don't want to have a debate about climate change. It's because the debate we agreed about was to talk about Trump and if he's going to be good or bad. And I brought up 3 points I wanted to talk about. I thought we were going to talk about for maybe an hour and a half. We've already surpassed that, and we've only talked about 1 point. That's why I'm trying to move along, because I think my chat's getting bored. I don't know about your chat, but this is a boring conversation. I wanted to have a good, entertaining discussion about Trump and if he's good or bad, and we're getting so bogged down in the numbers. And I agree it's important, but I'm just saying, let's do this in DMs and have a good and not boring conversation on stream, okay?
When someone says that trust the experts, trust the data, and then's unwilling to talk about what the experts say with the data, I think you should be highly suspicious of them.
So you're just highly suspicious of expertise.
Of you.
Okay.
That's what I'm highly suspicious of, someone who says trust the experts, and then when we start looking at the data, you say, no, we don't have time for that.
Okay.